Chapter 6. The Olive Merry-Go-Round. By May, the olive picking had been in progress for some time. The fruit had plumped and ripened throughout the hot summer days, and now it fell and lay shining in the grass like a harvest of black pearls. The peasant women appeared in droves, carrying tins and baskets on their heads. They would then crouch in circles around the base of the olive tree, chattering as shrilly as sparrows as they picked up the fruit and placed it in the containers. Some of the olive trees had been producing crops like this for 500 years, and for 500 years the peasants had been gathering the olives in precisely the same way. It was a great time for gossip and for laughter. I used to move from tree to tree, joining the different groups, squatting on my haunches, helping them pick up the glossy olives, hearing gossip all about the relatives and friends of the olive pickers, and occasionally joining them as they ate under the trees, wolfing down the sour black bread and the little flat cakes wrapped in vine leaves that were made out of last season's dried figs. Songs would be sung, and it was curious that the peasants' voices, so sour and raucous in speech, could be plaintively sweet when raised in harmony together. At that time of year, with the yellow, waxy crocuses just starting to bubble up among the olive roots and the banks purple with the campanulas, the peasants gathered under the trees looked like a moving flower bed, and the songs would echo down the naves between the ancient olives, the sound as melancholy and as sweet as goat bells. When the containers were piled high with the fruit, they would be hoisted up, and we would carry them down to the olive press in a long, chattering line. The olive press, a gaunt and gloomy building, was down in a valley through which ran a tiny glittering stream. The press was presided over by Papa Demetrios, a tough old man as twisted and bent as the olive trees themselves, with a completely bald head and an enormous moustache, snow white, except where it was stained yellow by nicotine, and reputed to be the biggest moustache in the whole of Corfu. Papa Demetrios was a gruff, bad-tempered old man, but for some reason he took a fancy to me, and we got along splendidly. He even allowed me into the Holy of Holies, the olive press. Here was a great circular trough like an ornamental fish pond, and mounted in it a gigantic grindstone with a central strut of wood jutting from it. This strut was harnessed to Papa Demetrios's ancient horse, which, with a sack over its head so that it did not get giddy, would circle the trough, thus rolling the great grindstone round and round so that it could crush the olives as they were poured into it in a glinting cascade. As the olives were crushed, a sharp, sour smell rose in the air. The only sounds were the solid ploddings of the horse's hooves and the rumbling of the great grindstone and the steady drip, drip of the oil trickling out of the vents of the trough, golden as distilled sunlight. In one corner of the press was a huge black crumbling mound that was the residue from the grinding, the crushed seeds, pulp, and skin of the olives forming black, crusty cakes like coarse peat. It had a rich, sweet, sour smell that almost convinced you it was good enough to eat. It was, in fact, fed to the cattle and horses with their winter food, and it was also used as a remarkably efficient, if somewhat over-pungent, fuel. Papa Demetrios, because of his bad temper, was left severely alone by the peasants, who would deliver their olives and depart from the press with all speed. For you were never certain whether anybody like Papa Demetrios might not have the evil eye. In consequence, the old man was lonely, and so he welcomed my intrusion into his domain. From me he would get all the local gossip, who had given birth, and whether it was a boy or a girl, who was courting whom, and sometimes a more juicy item, such as that Pepe Contos had been arrested for smuggling tobacco. In return for my acting as a sort of newspaper for him, Papa Demetrios would catch specimens for me. Sometimes it would be a pale pink gulping gecko or a praying mantis, or the caterpillar of an oleander hawk moth, striped like a Persian carpet, pink and silver and green. It was Papa Demetrios who got me one of the most charming pets that I had at that time, a spade-footed toad, which I christened Augustus Tickletummy. I had been down in the olive groves helping the peasants, and I started to feel hungry. I knew that Papa Demetrios always kept a good supply of food at the olive press, so I went down to visit him. It was a sparkling day with a rambustious, laughing wind that thrummed through the olive grove like a harp. There was a nip in the air, so I ran all the way with the dogs leaping and barking about me, and I arrived flushed and panting to find Papa Demetrios crouched over a fire that he constructed out of slabs of olive cake. "Ah," he said, glaring at me fiercely. "So you've come, have you? Where have you been? I haven't seen you for 2 days. I suppose now spring is here, you've got no time for an old man like me." I explained that I'd been busy with a variety of things, such as making a new cage for my magpies, since they had just raided Larry's room and stood in peril of their lives if they were not incarcerated. Said Papa Demetrios. "Ah, well, do you want some corn?" I said as nonchalantly as I could that there was nothing I would like better than corn. He got up and strutted, bow-legged, to the olive press, and reappeared carrying a large frying pan, a sheet of tin, a bottle of oil, and 5 golden-brown cobs of dried maize like bars of bullion. He put the frying pan on the fire and scattered a small quantity of oil into it, and then waited until the heat of the fire made the oil purr and twinkle and smoke gently in the bottom of the pan. Then he seized a cob of maize and twisted it rapidly between his arthritic hands so that the golden beads of corn pattered into the pan with a sound like rain on a roof. He put the flat sheet of tin over the top, gave a little grunt, and sat back, lighting a cigarette. "Have you heard about Andreas Populus?" he asked, running his fingers through his luxurious moustache. "No," I said, "I'd not heard." "Ah," he said with relish, "he's in hospital, that foolish one." I said I was sorry to hear it, because I liked Andreas. He was a gay, kind-hearted, exuberant boy who inevitably managed to do the wrong things. They said of him in the village that he would ride a donkey backwards if he could. What, I inquired, was his affliction? "Dynamite," said Papa Demetrios, waiting to see my reaction. I gave a slow whistle of horror and nodded my head slowly. Papa Demetrios, now assured of my undivided attention, settled himself more comfortably. "This is how it happened," he said. "He's a foolish boy, Andreas is, you know. His head is as empty as a winter swallow's nest. But he's a good boy, though. He never done anybody any harm. Well, he went dynamite fishing. You know that little bay down near Benitez? Ah, well, he took his boat there because he had been told that the country policeman had gone farther down the coast for the day. Of course, foolish boy, he never thought to check and make sure that the policeman was farther down the coast." I clicked my tongue sorrowfully. The penalty for dynamite fishing was 5 years in prison and a heavy fine. "Now," said Papa Demetrios, "he got into his boat and was rowing slowly along when he saw ahead of him in the shallow water a big shoal of barbooni. He stopped rowing and lit the fuse on his stick of dynamite." Papa Demetrios paused dramatically, peered at the corn to see how it was doing, and lit another cigarette. "It would have been all right," he went on, "but just as he was about to throw the dynamite, the fish swam away, and what do you think that idiot of a boy did? Still holding the dynamite, he rowed after them. Bang!" I said I thought that there could not be very much left of Andreas. "Oh, yes," said Papa Demetrios scornfully. "He can't even light dynamite properly. It was such a tiny stick, all it did was to blow off his right hand. But even so, he owes his life to the policeman who hadn't gone farther down the coast. Andreas managed to row to the shore, and there he fainted from loss of blood, and he would undoubtedly have died if the policeman, having heard the bang, had not come down to the shore to see who was dynamiting. Luckily, the bus was passing, and the policeman stopped it, and they got Andreas into it and into the hospital." I said I thought it was a great pity that it should happen to anybody as nice as Andreas, but he was lucky to be alive. I presumed that when he was better he would be arrested and sent to Vido for 5 years. "No, no," said Papa Demetrios. "The policeman said he thought Andreas had been punished quite enough. So he told the hospital that Andreas had caught his hand in some machinery." The corn had now started to explode, banging onto the tin like the explosions of miniature cannons. Papa Demetrios lifted the pan off the fire and took the lid off. There was each grain of corn, exploded into a little yellow and white cumulus cloud, scrunchy and delicious. Papa Demetrios took a twist of paper from his pocket and unwrapped it. It was full of coarse grains of grey sea salt, and into this we dipped the little clouds of corn and scrunched them up with relish. "I've got something for you," said the old man at last, wiping his moustache carefully with a large red and white handkerchief. Another one of those terrible animals that you're so eager to get. Stuffing my mouth with the remains of the popcorn and wiping my fingers on the grass, I asked him eagerly what it was. I'll fetch it, he said, getting to his feet. It's a very curious thing. I have never seen one like it before. I waited impatiently while he went into the olive press and reappeared, carrying a battered tin, the neck of which he had stuffed with leaves. There you are, he said. Be careful because it smells. I pulled out the plug of leaves and peered into the tin and discovered that Papa Demetrios was quite right. It smelt as strongly of garlic as a peasant bus on market day. In the bottom was crouched a medium-sized, rather smooth-skinned, greenish-brown toad, with enormous amber eyes and a mouth set in a perpetual but rather insane grin. As I put my hand into the tin to pick him up, he ducked his head between his forelegs, retracted his protuberant eyes into his skull in the odd way that toads have, and uttered a sharp bleating cry, rather like that of a miniature sheep. I lifted him out of the tin, and he struggled violently, exuding a terrible odour of garlic. I noticed that on each hind foot he had a horny black excrescence, blade-shaped, like a ploughshare. I was delighted with him, for I'd spent a considerable amount of time and energy trying to track down spade-footed toads without success. Thanking Papa Demetrios profusely, I carried him home triumphantly and installed him in an aquarium in my bedroom. I had placed earth and sand to a depth of 2 or 3 inches in the bottom of the aquarium, and Augustus, having been christened and released, immediately set to work to build himself a home. With a curious movement of his hind legs, working backwards, using the blades of his feet as spades, he very rapidly dug himself a hole and disappeared from view with the exception of his protuberant eyes and grinning face. Augustus, I soon discovered, was a remarkably intelligent beast, and had many endearing traits of character which made themselves apparent as he got tamer. When I went into the room, he would scuttle out of his hole and make desperate endeavours to reach me through the glass walls of the aquarium. If I took him out and placed him on the floor, he would hop around the room after me, and then if I sat down, would climb laboriously up my leg until he reached my lap, where he would recline in a variety of undignified attitudes, basking in the heat of my body, blinking his eyes slowly, grinning up at me, and gulping. It was then that I discovered he liked to lie on his back and have his stomach gently massaged by my forefinger, and so from this unusual behaviour he derived the surname of Tickle Tummy. He would also, I learned, sing for his food. If I held a large writhing earthworm over the top of the aquarium, Augustus would go into a paroxysm of delight, his eyes seeming to protrude more and more with excitement, and he would utter a series of little pig-like grunts and the strange bleating cry he'd given when I first picked him up. When the worm was finally dropped in front of him, he would nod his head vigorously as if in thanks, grab one end of it, and proceed to stuff it into his mouth with his thumbs. Whenever we had any guests, they were treated to an Augustus Tickle-Tummy recital, and they all agreed, gravely, that he had the best voice and repertoire of any toad they had met. It was round this time that Larry introduced Donald and Max into our life. Max was an immensely tall Austrian with curly blonde hair, a blonde moustache perched like an elegant butterfly on his lip, and intensely blue and kindly eyes. Donald, on the other hand, was short and pale-faced, one of those Englishmen who give you a first impression of being not only inarticulate, but completely devoid of personality. Larry had run into this ill-assorted couple in the town and had lavishly invited them up to have drinks. The fact that they arrived, mellowed by a variety of alcoholic stimuli, at 2 o'clock in the morning, did not strike any of us as being particularly curious, since by that time we were inured, or almost inured, to Larry's acquaintances. Mother had gone to bed early with a severe cold, and the rest of the family had also retired to their rooms. I was the only member of the household awake. The reason for this was that I was waiting for Ulysses to return to the bedroom from his nightly wanderings and devour his supper of meat and minced liver. As I lay there reading, I heard a dim, blurred sound echoing through the olive groves. I thought at first it was a party of peasants returning late from a wedding, and took no notice. Then the cacophony grew closer and closer, and from the clop and jingle accompanying it, I realized it was some late-night revellers passing on the road below in a cab. The song they were singing did not sound particularly Greek, and I wondered who they could be. I got out of bed and leaned out the window, staring down through the olive trees. At that moment the cab turned off the road and started up the long drive towards the house. I could see it quite clearly because whoever was sitting in the back had apparently lit a small bonfire. I watched this, puzzled and intrigued, as it flickered and shook through the trees on its way up to us. At that moment, Ulysses appeared out of the night sky like a silently drifting dandelion clock, and endeavoured to perch on my naked shoulder. I shook him off and went and fetched a plate of food, from which he proceeded to peck and gobble, uttering tiny throaty noises to himself and blinking his brilliant eyes at me. By this time, the cab had made slow but steady progress and had entered the forecourt of the house. I leaned out the window, enraptured by the sight. It was not, as I'd thought, a bonfire in the back of the cab. There were two individuals sitting there, each clasping an enormous silver candelabra, in which had been stuck some of the great white candles that one normally brought to put in the church of St. Cyberidion. They were singing loudly and untunefully, but with great panache, a song from The Maid of the Mountains, endeavouring, whenever possible, to harmonise. The cab rolled to a halt at the steps that led up to the veranda. "At 17, sighed a very British baritone. "At 17, intoned the other singer in a rather heavy Middle European accent. "He falls in love quite madly," said the baritone, waving his candelabra about wildly, "with eyes of tender blue." "Tender blue," intoned the Middle European accent, giving a lechery to these simple words that had to be heard to be believed. "At 25, continued the baritone, "he thinks he's got it badly." "Badly," said the Middle European accent dolefully. "With eyes of different hue," said the baritone, making such a wild gesture with his candelabra that the candles sped out of their sockets like rockets and fell sizzling onto the grass. My bedroom door opened, and Margot, clad in yards of lace and what appeared to be butter muslin, came in. "What on earth's that noise?" she asked in a hoarse, accusing whisper. "You know Mother's not well." I explained that the noise was nothing whatsoever to do with me, but apparently we had company. Margot leaned out the window and peered down at the cab, where the singers had just reached the next verse of their song. "I say," she called in muted tones, "do you mind not making quite so much noise? My mother's sick." Immediate silence enveloped the cab, and then a tall, gangling figure rose unsteadily to his feet. He held his candelabra aloft and gazed earnestly up at Margot. "Must not the lady," he intoned sepulchrally, "must not disturb Mother." "No, by Jove," agreed the English voice from the interior of the cab. "Who do you think they are?" Margot whispered to me in agitation. I said that to me the thing was perfectly clear. They must be friends of Larry's. "Are you friends of my brother's?" Margot fluted out of the window. "A noble being," said the tall figure, waving the candelabra at her. "He invited us for drinks." "Just a minute. I'll come down," said Margot. "To look you closer would be to fulfill the ambition of a lifetime," said the small man, bowing somewhat uncertainly. "See you closer," corrected a quiet voice from the back of the cab. "I'll go downstairs," said Margot to me, "and get them inside and keep them quiet. You go and wait Larry." I pulled on a pair of shorts, picked up Ulysses unceremoniously, who, with half-closed eyes, was digesting his food, and went to the window and threw him out. "Extraordinary," said the tall man, watching Ulysses fly away over the moon-silvered olive tops. "This like the house of Dracula, no, Donald?" "By Jove, yes," said Donald. I pattered down the corridor and burst into Larry's room. It took me some time to shake him awake, for under the firm impression that Mother had been breathing her cold germs over him, he had taken the precaution of consuming half a bottle of whiskey before he went to bed. Eventually, he sat up blearily and looked at me. "What the bloody hell do you want?" he inquired. I explained about the two characters in the cab, and that they said they had been invited to drinks. "Oh, Christ," said Larry. "Just tell them I've gone to Dubrovnik." I explained that I could not very well do this, as by now Margot would have lured them into the house, and that Mother, in her fragile condition, must not be disturbed. Groaning, Larry got out of bed and put on his dressing gown and slippers, and together we went down the creaking stairs to the drawing room. Here we found Max, lanky, flamboyant, good-natured, sprawled in a chair waving his candelabra at Margot, all of the candles of which had gone out. Donald sat hunched and gloomy in another chair, looking like an undertaker's assistant. "Your eyes, they are tender blue," said Max, waving a long finger at Margot. "We were singing about blue eyes, were we not, Donald?" "We were singing about blue eyes," said Donald. "That's what I said," said Max benevolently. "You said was," said Donald. Max thought about this for a brief moment. "Anyway," he said, "the eyes was blue." "Were blue," said Donald. "Oh, there you are," said Margot breathlessly as Larry and I came in. "I think these are friends of yours, Larry." "Larry!" bellowed Max, lurching up with the ungainly grace of a giraffe. "We have come like you told us." "How very nice," said Larry, forcing his sleep-crumpled features into something approaching an ingratiating smile. "Do you mind keeping your voice down, because my mother's sick?" "Mothers," said Max, with immense conviction, "are the most important thing in the world." He turned to Donald, laid a long finger across his moustache, and said, "Shh," with such violence that Roger, who'd sunk into a peaceful sleep, immediately leapt to his feet and started barking wildly. Whittle and Puke joined in vociferously. "Damn bad form, that," observed Donald between the barks. "Guest should not make his host's dog bark." Max went down on his knees and engulfed the still barking Roger in his long arms, a manoeuvre that I viewed with some alarm, since Roger, I felt, was quite capable of misinterpreting it. "Hush, Bow Wow," said Max, beaming into Roger's bristling and belligerent face. To my astonishment, Roger immediately stopped barking and started to lick Max's face extravagantly. "Would you, like a drink?" said Larry. "I can't ask you to stop long, of course, because, unfortunately, my mother's ill." "Very civil of you," said Donald. "Very civil indeed. I must apologize for him. Foreigner, you know." "Well, I think I'll just go back to bed," said Margot, edging tentatively towards the door. "No, you won't," Larry barked. "Somebody's got to pour out the drinks." "Do not," said Max, reclining on the floor with Roger in his arms and gazing at her piteously. "Do not remove those eyes from my orbit." "Well, I'll go and get the drinks then," said Margot breathlessly. "And I will help you," said Max, casting Roger from him and leaping to his feet. Roger had been under the misguided impression that Max had intended to spend the rest of the night cuddling him in front of the dying fire, and so was not unnaturally put out when he was thrown aside like this. He started barking again. The door of the drawing room burst open, and Leslie, stark naked except for a shotgun under his arm, made his appearance. "What the bloody hell's going on?" he asked. "Oh, Leslie, do go and put some clothes on," said Margot. "These are friends of Larry's." "Oh, God," said Leslie dismally. "Not more." He turned and made his way back upstairs. "Drinks," said Max, rapturously seizing Margot in his arms and waltzing her round to the accompaniment of almost hysterical barks on the part of Roger. "I do wish you'd try to be more quiet," said Larry. "Max, for Christ's sake." "Damn bad form," said Donald. "Remember my mother," said Larry, since this reference had obviously struck a chord in Max's soul. Immediately, he ceased waltzing with the breathless Margot and came to a halt. "Where is your mother?" he inquired. "The lady is sick. Take me to her, that I may secure her." "Succor," said Donald. "I'm here," said Mother in a slightly nasal voice from the doorway. "What is going on?" She was clad in her nightie and wearing, for reasons of her cold, a voluminous shawl over her shoulders. She carried under one arm the drooping, panting, apathetic figure of Dodo, her Dandle Dinmont terrier. "Why, you're just in time, Mother," said Larry. "I want you to meet Donald and Max." With the first sign of animation that he had shown, Donald rose to his feet, marched swiftly across the room to Mother, seized her hand, and gave a slight bow over it. "Enchanted," he said. "Terribly sorry about the disturbance. My friend, you know, Continental." "How nice to see you," said Mother, summoning up all her resources. At her entrance, Max had thrown his arms wide and was now gazing upon her with all the devoutness of a crusader catching his first sight of Jerusalem. "Mother," he intoned dramatically, "you are the mother." "How do you do?" said Mother uncertainly. "You are," Max asked, getting his facts straight, "the sick mother?" "No, it's just a bit of a cold," said Mother deprecatingly. "We have woke you," said Max, clasping his breast, his eyes brimming with tears. "Awoken or woken?" said Donald, sotto voce. "Come," said Max, and put his long arms around Mother and ushered her to a chair near the fire, pressing her into it with the utmost delicacy. He took off his coat and spread it gently about her knees. Then he squatted by her side, took her hand, and peered earnestly into her face. "What," he inquired, "does Mother want?" "An uninterrupted night's sleep," said Leslie, who had just returned, more conventionally garbed in a pair of pyjama trousers and sandals. "Max," said Donald sternly, "stop monopolizing the conversation. Remember what we've come for." "Of course," said Max delightedly. "We have wonderful news, Larry. Donald has decided to become an author." "Had to," murmured Donald modestly, "seeing all you chaps living in the lap of luxury, royalties pouring in, felt I must try my hand at it." "Oh, that's jolly good," said Larry, with a certain lack of enthusiasm. "I've just completed the first chapter," said Donald, "and so we came out hot foot, as it were, so that I could read it to you." "Oh, God," said Larry, horrified. "No, Donald, really. My critical faculties are completely dehydrated at 2:30 in the morning. Can't you leave it here and I'll read it tomorrow?" "It's short," said Donald, taking no notice of Larry and producing a small sheet of paper from his pocket, "but I think you'll find the style interesting." Larry gave an exasperated sigh, and we all sat back and listened expectantly while Donald cleared his throat. "Suddenly," he began in a deep, vibrant voice, "suddenly, there he was, and then suddenly, there she was, suddenly, and suddenly he looked at her, suddenly, and she suddenly looked at him, suddenly. She suddenly opened her arms, suddenly, and he opened his arms, suddenly. Then suddenly they came together, and suddenly, he could feel the warmth of her body, and suddenly, she could feel the warmth of his mouth on hers as they suddenly fell on the couch together." There was a long pause while we waited for Donald to go on. He gulped once or twice as though overcome with emotion at his own writing, folded the piece of paper carefully, and put it back in his pocket. "What do you think?" he inquired of Larry. "Well, it's a bit short," said Larry cautiously. "Ah, but what do you think of the style?" said Donald. "Well, it's interesting," said Larry. "I think you'll find it's been done before, though." "Couldn't have been," explained Donald. "You see, I only thought of it tonight." "I don't think you ought to have any more to drink," said Leslie loudly. "Hush, dear," said Mother. "What do you intend to call it, Donald?" "I thought," said Donald owlishly, "I thought I would call it the Suddenly Book." A very trenchant title," said Larry. "I feel, however, that your main characters could be padded out a little bit, in depth, as it were, before you get them all tangled up on the sofa." "Yes," said Donald, "you could well be right." "Well, that is interesting," said Mother, sneezing violently. "And now I think we really all ought to have a cup of tea." "I will make tea for you, Mother," said Max, leaping to his feet and starting all the dogs barking again. "I will help you," said Donald. "Margot, dear, you'd better go with them and just make sure they find everything," said Mother. When the three of them had left, Mother looked at Larry. "And these are the people," she said coldly, "you say are not eccentric." "Well, Donald's not eccentric," said Larry. "He's just a bit high." "And suddenly he was drunk," intoned Leslie, putting some more logs on the fire and kicking it into some semblance of a blaze. "They are both of them very good chaps," said Larry. "Donald's already laid half of Corfu by its ears." "What do you mean?" said Mother. "Well, you know how Corfiots love to worm every hidden secret out of you," said Larry. They're all convinced that since he appears to have private means and is so incredibly British, he must have a terribly posh background. So he's been amusing himself by telling them all different stories. He has so far, I have been assured, been the eldest son of a duke, the cousin of the Bishop of London, and the illegitimate son of Lord Chesterfield. He has been educated at Eton, Harrow, Oxford, Cambridge, and, to my delight, this morning Mrs. Panopoulos assured me that he had assured her that his formal education had been undertaken at Girton. Just at that moment, Margot came back into the drawing room, looking slightly distraught. "I think you'd better come and do something about them, Larry," she said. "Max has just lighted the kitchen fire with a £5 note, and Donald has disappeared and keeps shouting cooey at us, and we can't see where he's gone." All of us trooped down to the gigantic stone-flagged kitchen, where a kettle was starting to sing on one of the charcoal fires, and Max was contemplating woefully the charred remains of a £5 note, which he held in one hand. "Really, Max," said Mother, "what a silly thing to do." Max beamed at her. "No expense spared for Mother," he said, and then, pressing the remains of the fiver into her hand, "Keep it, Mother, as a souvenir." "Coo!" came a doleful, echoing cry. "That's Donald," said Max proudly. "Where is he?" said Mother. "I don't know," said Max. "When he wants to hide, he wants to hide." Leslie strode to the back door and flung it open. "Donald," he called, "are you there?" "Cooey!" came a quavering cry from Donald with subtle echoing overtones. "Christ," said Leslie, "the silly bastard's fallen down the well." In the garden at the back of the kitchen there was a large well some 50 feet deep, with a thick, round iron pipe running right down the shaft. From the echoing qualities of Donald's voice, we were quite sure that Leslie's guess was right. Carrying a lamp, we made our way hurriedly up to the edge of the well and peered in a circle down into its dark depths. Halfway down the pipe was Donald, his arms and legs entwined firmly around it. He gazed up at us. "Cooey," he said coyly. "Oh, Donald, don't be such a bloody fool," said Larry exasperatedly. "Come up out of there. If you fall into that water, you'll drown. Not that I worry about that, but you'll pollute our entire water supply." "Shan't," said Donald. "Donald," said Max, "we want you. Come, it's cold down there. Come and have some tea with Mother, and we will talk more about your book." "Do you insist?" asked Donald. "Yes, yes, we insist," said Larry impatiently. Slowly and laboriously Donald climbed up the pipe, while we watched him breathlessly. When he was within easy reach, Max and the entire family leaned over the well, grabbed various portions of his anatomy, and hauled him to safety. Then we escorted our guests back into the house and plied them with vast quantities of hot tea until they seemed as sober as they were likely to be without having slept. "I think you'd better go home now," said Larry firmly, "and we'll meet you in town tomorrow." We escorted them out onto the veranda. The cab stood with the horse drooping forlornly between the shafts. The cab driver was nowhere to be seen. "Did they have a cab driver?" Larry asked of me. I said that, quite honestly, I'd been so captivated by the sight of their candelabras that I had not noticed. "I will drive," said Max, "and Donald shall sing to me." Donald arranged himself carefully in the back of the cab with the candelabras, and Max took to the driving seat. He cracked the whip in a most professional manner, and the horse aroused itself from its comatose condition, gave a sigh, and then shambled off down the drive. "Good night!" shouted Max, waving his whip. We waited until they disappeared from sight behind the olive trees, and then trooped back inside the house, and with sighs of heartfelt relief, closed the front door. "Really, Larry, you shouldn't invite people at this hour of night," said Mother. "I didn't invite them at this hour of night," said Larry, annoyed. "They just came. I invited them for drinks." Just at that moment there was a thunderous knocking on the front door. "Well, I'm off," said Mother, and scuttled upstairs with considerable alacrity. Larry opened the front door, and there stood the distraught figure of the cab driver. "Where's my cappuccino?" he shouted. "Where were you?" retorted Larry. "The curios had taken it." "They've stolen my cappuccino!" shouted the man. "Of course they haven't stolen it, foolish one," said Larry, now tried beyond endurance. "Because you weren't waiting here, they took it to get back into town. If you run quickly, you can catch them up." Imploring Saint Spiridion to help him, The man ran off through the olive trees and down towards the road. Determined not to miss the last act in this drama, I ran to a vantage point where I got a clear view of the entrance to our drive and a stretch of moonlit roadway which led into town. The cab had just left the drive and arrived on the road at a brisk walk, Donald and Max singing happily together. At that moment, the cab driver appeared through the olives, and screaming imprecations, he started to run after them. Max, startled, looked over his shoulder. "Wolves, Donald!" he shouted. "Hold tight!" He proceeded to belabor the behind of the unfortunate horse, who, startled, broke into a gallop. But it was the sort of gallop that only a Corfu cab horse could achieve. It was just sufficiently fast to keep the cab owner running at full stretch some 10 paces behind the cab. He was shouting and imploring and almost weeping with rage. Max, determined to save Donald at all costs, was belabouring the horse unmercifully, while Donald leaned over the back of the cab and shouted "Bang!" at intervals, and thus they disappeared out of my sight along the Corfu road. The following morning at breakfast, all of us felt slightly jaded, and Mother was lecturing Larry severely for allowing people to turn up at 2 o'clock in the morning for drinks. Just at that moment, Spiro's car drove up to the front of the house, and he waddled onto the veranda where we were sitting, clasping in his arms an enormous, flat, brown paper parcel. "This is for you, Mrs. Durrell," he said. "For me?" said Mother, adjusting her spectacles. "What on earth can it be?" She unwrapped the brown paper cautiously, and there inside, as bright as a rainbow, was the biggest box of chocolates I had ever seen in my life. Pinned to it was a little white card on which had been written in a rather shaky hand, "With apologies for last night, Donald and Max."